So our first speaker is Dan. He is principal investigator in Exotopic, and he will tell us about UK startup community and how it works with the Gulf region. So Dan, the floor is yours.
Right, good afternoon, everyone. Really pleased to be able to speak to you today. So I'm going to do a bit of a personalized talk, so maybe slightly different than usual, because I think, as I said in the intro, I think space is quite a small community. It's a very friendly community, and I think working across continents is quite a fascinating endeavor. So I titled my talk "Bridging Continents," and I just want to give perhaps a bit of background why I think that's interesting and important. So. Firstly, a bit of an intro, and I want to just briefly say, why do people work internationally and why is the space sector quite international, especially from a UK perspective? Secondly, just talking about some existing momentum, just flashing up a few things that are happening in the UK related to the Gulf. And then lastly, some kind of tips and tricks, so things that I found having done work in the Middle East the last couple of years. And hopefully, again, that can be part of the equation of helping people to, be a bit demystify in terms of how to, get some work over there. So firstly, who am I and why do I care about this topic? What made people do what they do? I'm always interested in people's motivations. So if you'll indulge me for a minute. So I've got kind of a weird international background. I grew up in the US and Italy in my youth. I hopped around at university quite a lot. I did undergraduate in the US and then across Germany, Sweden, France. I did a master's degree that took me to several places for bits of time. I think at one point I had an open bank account in 5 countries, which was a bit weird to manage. So kind of from the start, I was quite internationally minded person. I've got multiple passports, and so I've always been quite a sort of a non-traditional type person in terms of international things. In terms of my work life, most of my life was spent as an engineer. So these are some of the platforms for measuring vibration that I spent about a decade designing and testing at a place in the UK called the National Physical Laboratory that we delivered to ESA. So a number of these now sit in ESA facilities at STech in the Netherlands. So that was kind of my big work engagement internationally, very much in the kind of European space sector at that point, not really beyond that. But it gave me a really good foundation in engineering, in space systems, the sort of things that are needed to build, test, deliver satellites. So you can kind of see from that background, that's kind of my personal motivation for why I almost have a strong kind of innate desire to just work internationally, to travel, to do interesting things. I do think that is a big driver of people who work in the space industry. So I think it's quite normal and one of the things that makes it quite interesting because no one country has the capabilities, has the people to be able to do things. So I think it's kind of good to acknowledge that everybody comes from a different perspective. So I'm really pleased that we can have this webinar talking about 2 quite different cultural and kind of business environments. So Exotopic itself, what do we do? Kind of our strapline is connecting science with business. So we're a startup consultancy, although I would say we're a bit unusual. So apart from normal consultancy that we do, we're quite active on the hardware and sort of on hands-on side. We do investment in other companies. I've got another slide where I show you a couple of things. So we've got 3 startups that we're actively incubating and I do work with on a daily basis at times. We do business development and we're really connectors. So, a number of the people on the call we have relationships with, and we work with in the past. And so we're really interested in the UK and helping build up an ecosystem for space. And one of my key interests is how to do that in the Middle East. So as a UK company, how can we go in and copy paste some of the things we've done successfully in the UK, but also figure out, how can there be maybe in-country activity, bridging activities, and sort of how can we work better together? I think there's some activity at the moment, and there's definitely momentum, but I think it's quite nascent in terms of where that's going. So I think this is quite, again, interesting kind of aspect of this. As a bit of an aside, with some other interesting things that, again, I'm involved with, I have a bit of a national flavor. So we, somewhat haphazard by chance, we ended up on a Korean documentary you can see on the left with one of our partner companies, Range. And it's up being I wasn't dubbed, but there's lots of Korean narrators speaking over the video, which I don't understand, but that was quite an interesting experience. So that was our site in the west of Scotland where they came and looked at some of the antennas being developed in the company, and I was able to be part of that. And then one of the other links I've got, again, with a bit of an international flavor, and actually one of the talks you'll see from Ralph from 3S Northumbria, is actually from the accelerator. So I've been working quite a lot the last couple of years with the UK Space Agency, delivering an accelerator program, working a lot with investors as well, because obviously investment is a really big theme in space. It's quite capital intensive, a lot of the companies that you'll see today. And so it's been quite an interesting journey. And a lot of the companies on there are quite interested in international markets. So whether that's the US or the Middle East, but they're all interested in partnerships and investment. So I think the idea of international kind of bridge building is kind of just inherent in everything for me personally, but also I think the space industry in particular in the UK. So a couple notes on kind of UK environment at the moment. I keep this pretty high level, but I just want to highlight from a government perspective, there's quite a lot of activity trying to kind of set at a very high level some of the international cooperation. So kind of reference, some work from a few years ago, government kind of intentionally saying, right, we want to work together. We want to have better trading relationships with the Middle East and the Gulf in particular. There have been a number of things in the past year or so. So about a year ago and a couple of years previous to that, there's been a lot of activity around space-based solar power as an activity that's quite relevant in the Gulf because of the big focus on energy and the kind of transition to new energy that I know a lot of the countries are part of, and figuring out what that means for people in the UK, people in the Gulf. And a lot of that is centered around NEOM as well. So for people who aren't aware, in Saudi, you might have seen stories in the media about NEOM, which is kind of this line city which is 100 and something kilometers long. But actually NEOM is really a place where quite a lot of innovation is being placed in Saudi, and there's a lot of sort of interesting thing there. So some of the work with space solar in the UK is centered around collaborations with NEOM. So that's quite an interesting aspect. So you can kind of see that there's a lot of stuff from a high level that then trickles down into kind of small businesses and startup world. And so kind of my message from this is I think it's really useful to kind of have a sense of when governments are kind of moving in a certain direction and trying to leverage that as much as possible. So if there's momentum, there clearly is here, but there's no, I would say, it's not no evidence yet. The outputs of all this, I would say, is quite unclear. So a little bit, like I said, this webinar, right? It's up to us collectively to create this future. So it's great to have signals from government, but that only goes so far. So it's really up to companies working, trying to develop new things to try to go into these new markets. So I think my kind of message from the UK side is I think there's a lot of appetite, but there's, I think, some clear barriers. There are cultural barriers, there are understanding barriers, which is basically how do you work? So that's kind of the last point I want to cover on here. A few tips and tricks of things that I've picked up. I unfortunately can't really speak about contracts I've had because I've got non-disclosure agreements in place. So I'm kind of keeping this quite high level, but I've got 3 points for you. So first, and I cannot possibly emphasize this enough, is to find friends and speak to them. And in particular, I mean government and primes. So by that, I mean leverage every possible thing you can, because if you're going into an unfamiliar environment, you have to speak to and engage with and get help from people who are already there and who know how the things work. So one aspect is government. So I just put Department of Business and Trade and an example from the defense world, UK DSE, both really helpful organizations. They have people placed in the Middle East who are there full time, that are connected to various embassies. We have people like, Conor McGregor, who works for DBT, who's kind of the space lead in the Middle East. He's based in Oman. These are really helpful people who can help connect you. They champion UK companies. So I would say if you've never dealt with kind of these arms of UK government and you have any interest at all in, from the UK going there, get in touch with these people. They're very accessible. You can find details online. Don't be kind of scared off by that. Really, really important. The second bit, again, without mentioning any names, I would say one of the really big hurdles you have, especially as a smaller company, is how in the world do you find contracts? How do you assign contracts? How do you deal with the, really, really challenging paperwork and environment in the Middle East in particular? You have really strange things to a UK company, like, needing bonds. Different countries have different levels of incorporation needed, and they have ownership issues in terms of some countries mandate, if you are active in an area, you need to have a certain amount of local ownership. So all these sort of things are very difficult. It's very unlikely that you will get a first contract directly with the government. It's quite hard. So I would say do yourself a favor, speak to primes, find out who's working in a region. So these might be large engineering primes. Again, don't want to mention any companies, but you can imagine who they are. So these might be kind of generic engineering primes. They might be large space companies. They might be infrastructure providers. They might be consultancies, sort of big four type consultancies. All these companies are quite active in the region. And if you start digging around, you can find the context for them. Really happy to have a chat with anyone individually who's interested in kind of knowing. But I would say those two are really important things, because if you're starting from nothing, you can very quickly get up to speed, and you'll find these people quite receptive to speaking with you. Second bit was just go to events. So again, I suspect Ralph Dins will mention the SSA conference, which he just recently went to, which was on space degree. You cannot beat being in person. I think in the Middle East in particular, this is from my perspective, in-person relations are incredibly important. You can't build relationships online. You might be able to start them, you might be able to reach out, but I just don't see any substitute for actually being there. So it does take some investment, but it's absolutely worthwhile. There have been a couple of recent exhibitions we've gone to. So I went to the World Defense Show in Saudi, really interesting. Was able to speak to a lot of government people, both in Saudi and from other bits in the Middle East. A lot of UK companies presented there. And that was a really, really good event. I found it quite useful. Just recently, a couple of weeks ago, there was LEAP. So really, really large tech event where UK government had a big presence. A number of UK companies were there. So I kind of hate to break it to you, but in my view, the Gulf is a place where you just have to go. And at some point, you might just have to take the chance, go to an event, because it's really, really important to have that in person for something unfamiliar. And the last thing I'll say, as I kind of end here, is just embrace uncertainty. I think if you want to go into a new place, you need to be ready for uncertainty. You need to be agile. You need to take advantage of opportunities. I sort of jokingly put on there, early bird gets the worm. That's a very common term. But when I heard recently, I thought that was very funny, is also the second mouse gets the cheese. So by that, I mean, if it's the first mouse that gets caught in the trap, and then the second one could come along and get the cheese. So I think there's a lot of craftiness involved in terms of having a bit of a strategy that says, I know there'll be uncertainty. That's okay. So I'm going to try to figure out what advantages I can take, who I can work with, what things I can find. So, get in touch with people like Alex, SpaceTech Gulf. Use everything at your disposal, and you just bit by bit, I think you can use your kind of startup skills. And I think it's a really good way to attack this market and hopefully, get some leverage and be able to build these bridges. So with that, I will pass back to Alex. Thank you very much. If anybody wants to, have a discussion, very, very open, be really pleased to connect with any of you on the webinar. My details are there. Thanks.